We go until 2:15.
2:15, and then we don't want to run over it all because we want to make sure we get to the World War II Museum. Well, you've heard a lot already this morning. I'm going to abuse the privilege of the chair. I'm just going to be a facilitator here. Well, I'm sure I'll have something to say at some point. But I wanted to address a question to start to each person. And then we'll just throw this open. I'm going to try to call on everybody, as many of you as have questions, and we'll just have a discussion going from there. But two quick questions. I'll mention them both. I mean, I think one is more properly directed to Professor White and one to Professor Kennedy, but they can answer as they wish. This particular grant is called Making Connections, Mississippi History as American History. And so one of the big things we've been trying to do is to think about national processes through the lens of Mississippi. And so one of the questions I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about is, I know it's not what you've written on, but Governor Bilbo. And I'd really like to hear the Mississippi version of the story of Huey Long that you've told. And then, David, I had a question that I wanted to also pose to you. In the Frances Perkins quote you read us, she quoted Franklin Roosevelt as saying, you know, we need to be mindful of the habits of our legislature.
That was her own statement.
Oh, her own statement. And the prejudices of our people. And one of the prejudices was an anti-black prejudice, and one of the hallmarks of the New Deal, as you know, was that some of these programs excluded black people. The Social Security Act, for example, exempted three main employment categories: teachers, that'd be you all, agricultural workers, and domestic workers. And agricultural workers and domestic workers were the two largest categories of black employment. So black people were excluded from the social safety net that was established. And so I thought I would throw those two questions out in whatever order you want to take them, just to get us started, and then we'll have a discussion. I'd love to hear about Bilbo.
Well, I think the Bilbo comparison with Huey Long would be an excellent one. I'm not deeply familiar with Bilbo's reign. I think the questions I think that would really be interesting to answer would be, what made Huey Long so much more successful at becoming a demagogue than Bilbo, and comparing the two states. Justice Brandeis years ago looked upon the states as laboratories of democracy. We have a number of 50, and we can compare one state with the next, and make a lot of conclusions, and really home in on what democratic theory and practice is all about. And so this is two microcosms at the same period of history that we could compare. An example I use in my classes at LSU are the example of Texas and Louisiana back in the 1970s, when each state was developing a new constitution. You would think that Louisiana, with its rough and tumble politics, would have much more difficulty in writing a new constitution than Texas. But in reality, it was just the opposite. Louisiana was very successful and created a relatively progressive and successful constitution in the early 70s. It was our 11th. We'd had plenty of practice in writing constitutions. But over in Texas, right next to us, it was a total failure. Texas still has their old anachronistic constitution. Their legislature only meets every 2 years. They have a very weak governor. So it's a very non-progressive state as far as structure, but it's a very progressive state in reality. So the comparison, any chance we get to have the same platform to compare two states, Mississippi and Louisiana during the 1930s, with two very crazy people vying for power, two very power-hungry politicians, and one successful nationally. When Huey died, he had 2 million followers of his Share the Wealth program, a very extreme socialist idea related to what Dr. Kennedy was talking this morning, of that era where people would be guaranteed a certain amount of income. You would tax the millionaires so much percentage of their salary. Bilbo was in the same camp, but much less successful. I think it comes down to a lot of things: timing, the personality himself, how much energy he had. I think you had a lot more energy than Bilbo. But the state politics and the state cultures were very different. Mississippi was a lot more stable, was less populistic, less volatile, less fractionalized than Mississippi at the time. Bilbo only had to appeal to the planter aristocracy for his power. Huey got his power from just pure personal strength. And a much different situation than the two. Thank you.
I think that-
Yeah, I'm going to respond to your question, Jim, by referencing three individuals. It's a little story about each and how I think it adds up, I hope, to an answer to your question. The general question being the issue of racial justice and equality in the New Deal period. And the people I'm going to discuss are Norman Thomas, whom I already mentioned, Henry Morgenthau, who was Secretary of the Treasury, and Andrew Young, who was also mentioned earlier this morning. So Kenneth and I were talking about the Norman Thomas episode earlier as we were out for lunch. Excuse me. Norman Thomas, to repeat, is the head of the American Socialist Party. The Socialist Party was very active in the cause of especially sharecropper justice in the South, to make sure the sharecroppers, predominantly black, got access to New Deal agricultural support programs and so on. And Norman Thomas took a personal trip through the South. I think it was 1936. I might have the year off by a year one way or the other. And he was in someplace in Mississippi. He was actually run out of town coercively. He was quite afraid for his life. And he came back and he actually got a meeting with Franklin Roosevelt in the Oval Office to discuss this trip he just made in the South. And he essentially said, Franklin, they were old friends, they addressed each other by first name. He said, Franklin, you've got to take up the cause of black people in the South, and it's just awful down there, and the thing that you can do concretely right now is to throw your weight behind this anti-lynching bill, which is in the Congress. It was a bill the likes of which eventually get incorporated into legislation in the 1960s. There were precursors of the Reconstruction era, which put federal authority in a big way in place in the South to make sure that what we today call hate crimes didn't exist or didn't go unpunished. And Roosevelt conspicuously was mute on that bill and just wouldn't publicly support it. And Norman Thomas kept pressing him and saying, you've got to do it, it's the right thing to do, and you can do it, it's within your power. And at some point, Roosevelt just said, I know the South, I know it better than you do, and a new day is coming in the South, but it isn't here yet, and I cannot do this because the Congress especially is in the hands of Democratic chairpeople in both the Senate and the House, and they run the show, and if I push on the race issue very hard, I'll lose their support for the entirety of my program, and everything will go down the drain. And Norman Thomas still wouldn't let up. And he kept saying, well, that may be true, but you've got to have some guts and some spine and backbone here, take the risk and do it. And finally, Roosevelt said to him, he said, Norman, he said, I'm a damn sight better politician than you are, and I know what I'm doing here, and just back away. And Norman Thomas finally conceded defeat. He said, well, I guess you're right, Franklin, because you're sitting on that side of the desk and I'm sitting on this side of the desk. Well, it's a story about two people discussing one of the most vexed issues in our nation's history. But it says something about Roosevelt was not oblivious to these concerns. And indeed, as Kenneth was reminding me earlier, Eleanor Roosevelt was a quite outspoken voice for racial justice in this era, especially for a first lady. It was really extraordinary how forward-leaning she was on that. But Roosevelt made the political calculation, as he did again in a kind of a parallel way with health care and the Social Security Act, that there were some things which would upset the whole apple cart, and he wanted to get accomplished the core of his program at least, and bide his time on the other things. And I'm going to come back to that longer strategic vision just but let me next move to Henry Morgenthau, Secretary of the Treasury in the Roosevelt administration, who played an instrumental role in the matter that you referred to, Jim, and that is the exclusion of agricultural and domestic workers from coverage under the Social Security Act. And how did that come about? Actually, it goes right back to the moment that I was referring to this morning earlier, when I quoted that remark of Roosevelt's to you about when the actuaries presented him with the data that there would have to be general revenues from the Treasury contribution to the Social Security program by some date in the 1980s to keep it financially sound. And he said, no, that's the dole by another name. We're not going to hold the American people hostage in 1980 any more than 1935. Can't have it. So they had to do something to avoid that, and they didn't know what to do. And Morgenthau came in with the suggestion, well, we'll just shrink the scope of the program. We'll bring fewer people into it, and that's the way we'll keep it on the actuarial basis, where it'll be self-financing from payroll taxes and employer taxes, and thus honor the president's wishes. But it's important to note here that the driving force is this fiscal orthodoxy of keeping the thing, its character as a private insurance plan and making it a property right and not a civil right. That's the deep principle that drives everything. So they shrink the program. How are they going to shrink it? Well, that's when they said, well, how about agricultural workers